Hey there, Schrodingers. It's me, Mr.Woollard. I'm here to read you The Callers by Kiah. We will be reading the book throughout the term, so I'm going to ask you not to watch ahead, only watch the chapters we have read together in class. It is also for when you're sick and you miss out on a chapter, you can go back and listen to it so you're not missing out on any of the story and any of our characterization. Let's get started with chapter 1. Quint Octavius had been staring at the same blank spot on the table for 26 minutes. "Banana," he said, for the 12th time. He held his breath. Nothing happened. Again. Quinn opened his eyes as wide as he could. Maybe he wasn't staring hard enough. Drops of liquid gathered at the corners of his eyes. His eyebrows ached. "Banana," said Quinn, a little louder this time. His nose twitched. He opened his eyes even wider still. Something was about to happen. He could feel it. Someone behind him snorted. Quinn froze. He hadn't realized there was anyone else in the room. "I think you almost had it that time," said his sister, Davinia. Quinn could hear the laughter in her voice. He sighed. "What do you want, Dav?" he asked, keeping his gaze fixed on the table. "I just want to help," she told him. "I don't want your help," said Quinn. "Maybe you should try something else," said Davinia, ignoring him. She held out her hand. "Like an orange or a melon." Quinn watched as the air shimmered and the fruit thudded softly on the table. Then Davinia held out her hand again. "Though, a banana does sound good to me," she said with a sly grin. But this time Quinn was ready. He shot out his hand as the banana shimmered into being and caught it before it hit the table. Davinia rolled her eyes as Quinn pulled back the skin. "Nice one." "Thanks," he said, with a confidence he didn't quite feel. Quinn took a bite, and Davinia's eyes narrowed again. "You must be nervous about the test next week," she said. Quinn took another bite of the banana so he wouldn't have to answer, and traced the leaf-shaped birthmark at the base of his palm. "You know, I don't think there's ever been an Octavius who wasn't a caller," Davinia grinned. "Just think, you could make history, little brother." The first Octavius not to call. In any other family, Quinn's lack of ability would be normal. Callers were rare. The ability to call, to conjure things, was a gift that appeared only once every few generations. But in the Octavius family, the ability was not exceptional. It was expected. And anything less than a strong calling ability was not enough. Quinn felt a familiar twist in his stomach, the one that always appeared when he thought about the Octavius legacy and his failed calling attempts. And the test was next week. He rubbed his palm again, then stopped when Davinia smirked at him. "Shouldn't you be at Chambers?" said Quinn, trying to shift her attention to something else. Davinia's grin widened, and Quinn knew that she knew she'd gotten to him. "Not today," she shrugged. Council doesn't officially admit new members until after the tests. Council, the ruling body of Ellipsom, was based in their city, Orbis. It was made up of only the strongest callers. New members were elected by current council members. Unofficially, there was no way Davinia wouldn't be admitted. She was one of the strongest callers to pass the test in the last 5 years. And she was an Octavius. Besides, what's more important than helping my little brother? Chair. Quinn almost jumped as wood hit the ground next to him. Davinia rested her hand along the carved back of the chair she had called. "You're not meant to call constructed materials," he reminded his sister, even as he admired her skill. There was little point in reprimanding her. There wasn't much that Davinia took seriously. Quinn marveled at the chair's smooth design and solid legs. It always amazed him how each called thing seemed so unique. Davinia raised her eyebrows. "Are you the expert?" she asked him. She watched him as he studied the chair. "What are you looking at?" she asked. And because she did it without a bite in her voice, Quinn took a chance. "Do you—" He hesitated, trying to think of words that wouldn't make him sound as ignorant as he was. "Do you design the chair in your mind before you call it?" Davinia blinked, surprised by the question. She considered for a moment. "No," she said. They both sat. the silence between them light for once, and Quinn felt a flash of pride that he'd managed to ask a question about calling that Dav hadn't considered. Others might have to, but I guess I'm just so good that it's instinctive, Davinia added, and the moment was gone. Quinn was working out how best to tell his sister to go away when a loud cry sounded outside the window. They both looked up to see Dawn, their mother's rhinodrite, landing in their central courtyard. "Mum's home," sang Davinia under her breath, with a sideways look at her brother. Quinn ignored her, tracking Dawn's movements, his breath catching as it always did at the sight of her landing. Like all rhinodrites, Dawn stood twice as tall as a human and as long as 3. With thick grey skin and horns like the common rhinoceros, rhinodrites boasted 3 major differences: their size, their loyalty, and a set of strong wings. Dawn's were currently stretched out to capacity as she glided down. Quinn had always dreamed of riding one, had actually dreamed about it more than once. Unfortunately, rhinodrites didn't tolerate the presence of anyone apart from the person who had called them by name. Quinn could still remember sneaking out of the house when he was younger to try and ride Dawn while his mother slept. Luckily, Adriana had woken in time to stop Quinn before he got close enough for the rhinodrite to react. "He could have been killed," she'd scolded him. Quinn hadn't tried again since, but sometimes he found himself wishing he was as bold now as he had been then. He still found it hard to draw his gaze away from the sight of the rhinodrite's power and grace. Now his mother was vaulting off Dawn and started toward the house with long strides. "I wonder if she'll be in a better mood," said Davinia, watching beside him. She'd been in a foul temper ever since her trip to the Spurges last week. Not for the first time. Quinn marveled at Davinia's ability to casually refer to their mother's mood, as if it wasn't terrifyingly unpredictable. He figured Davinia's confidence came from the fact that she didn't have to constantly try to prove herself. She was right, though. Adriana had been in a bad mood since the Spurges. The Spurges were just past the outskirts of Orbis. They were older than the capital city and more derelict. The area was largely inhabited by people who refused to use or consume cold goods. They claimed it was wrong to rely on things created from thin air. Radicals, Quinn had heard his mother call them in her public addresses. Wild was what Davinia muttered to Quinn whenever they were mentioned. Quinn still hadn't decided what he thought. All he knew was that people from the Spurges made him uncomfortable, with their passionate claims that nothing should come from nothing. The soil was as infertile there as it was on the rest of Ellipsom, but they still insisted on growing their own food from seed. Generally, council left them to their own devices. They're too insignificant to bother, his mother had said more than once. Still, she'd bothered last week. At the sound of his mother's footsteps, Quinn pushed the thought aside. It wouldn't surprise him if she somehow managed to see into his brain. "Are you sure you don't have somewhere else to be?" he asked Davinia as she sank into the chair next to him. "Like the other side of the planet?" he muttered under his breath. Though, even from that barren wasteland, he imagined, Davinia would find some way to annoy him. Davinia swung her legs up onto the table and leaned back. "Nope," she said with a grin. A moment later, the door clicked open and Adriana Octavius walked in. Quinn held his breath and waited as she took in the items on the table, the chair, and Davinia lounging in it. Her eyes sharpened on Quinn. "Who called the fruit?" she asked, not in a better mood then. Quinn thought about lying, but she'd probably make him prove it anyway. "Davinia," he said softly. His mother was silent. She didn't even bother sighing. "You shouldn't call constructed materials," she said to Davinia instead, touching the back of the chair. Though the words were a reprimand, Quinn swallowed at the pride in her voice. Their mother might be chief counselor, but she was an Octavius first. Displays of power, particularly in her own household, always impressed her. "Sorry, Mother," said Davinia, but she slid a look at Quinn. "Have you called anything today?" his mother asked him. She already knew the answer. Quinn suspected she just wanted him to admit it out loud. "No," he said quietly. There was a beat, and then Cassius has been making excellent progress with his calling, Adriana said mildly. Quinn hated the feeling of shame that trickled through him. He was proud of his best friend, happy for him, but somehow the tone of his mother's voice alone managed to make Quinn feel bad. He wasn't even sure she knew about Cassius's calling skills. The room pulsed with silence again, and Quinn's head hurt. "A council vehicle will collect us at 9 tomorrow," said Adriana finally to Quinn. "Don't be late." She turned to Davinia. "Come, Davinia, I need your assistance with something," she said, before sweeping from the room. She didn't look at Quinn again. Davinia waved cheerily to Quinn over her shoulder as she followed behind. Where were they going at 9 the next morning? Quinn was surrounded by green. It wrapped around him in thick lines that twisted and darted away in every direction. He reached forward, and suddenly he was falling, breathing in colour as patterns swirled around him. Quinn woke, a light sheen of sweat coating his forehead. His mouth felt dry. He automatically fumbled for the notebook and pencils he kept beside his bed. His mind still half in his dream, he pressed pencil to paper, splashing patterns across the page until he felt like he could breathe again, until the colour faded from his mind. He rested the notebook against his pillow as sunlight began to slant through his half-open window. He'd been having the same dream for a few years now, or a version of the same dream at least. 2 or 3 nights a week he would find himself ripped from a sleep filled with patterns so vivid he felt like he could touch them. Quinn flicked back through his notebook, studying the intricate patterns he'd drawn over the months before. They were all slightly different, he'd realized, but all related, like different pieces of the same jigsaw puzzle. Maybe they were his brain's way of coping with his stress about calling. Quinn looked up at his clock. There were still 2 hours before he had to get ready. With a sigh, he put his notebook back beside his bed. His mother still hadn't told him where they were going, but facing it tired was unlikely to be a good idea. Turning away from his notebook, Quinn rolled over and closed his eyes again. They were going to the Spurges. Adriana had calmly announced it the moment they got into the sleek black car, and then hadn't spoken again since. Reading her mood, Quinn knew not to break the silence to ask why they were going. He watched out the window as they slid through the manicured street office, blinking occasionally when the sun caught the wrong angle on a building and trying to figure out what his mother was up to. She hadn't asked Davinia to come, which meant she must have a specific reason for taking Quinn. They were almost on the outskirts of Orbis before she spoke again. "You remember Milo Valerius?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I do," said Quinn cautiously. Milo had been in the same grade as Quinn, up until his family pulled him out of class and moved him to the Spurges. That had been the first time Quinn had ever heard of someone moving out of Orbis. No one had spoken about it after it had happened. Quinn could even remember his mother firmly recommending he and Cass pick a new topic when she overheard them talking about it. Quinn hadn't sat at the same table as Milo, but he'd seen him every day. And then, suddenly, it was like he'd ceased to exist, which, as Quinn discovered when he researched it alone in the library later, he almost had. According to the one document Quinn had managed to find, to move to the Spurges and willingly live a life without cord provisions, you had to request that your data be removed from council system, to give up your access to food supply and central medical services. Most people who lived in the Spurges were born in the Spurges and died in the Spurges. "Good," said Adriana, turning to face out the window again. He felt a thread of unease run through him. What did their visit have to do with his old classmate? The vehicle hummed to a stop not long afterward, in front of a row of ramshackle houses. "I'm counting on your assistance today," his mother said, holding his gaze before opening the door and stepping out. Quinn felt the apprehension in his stomach pull into a knot. He wasn't sure whether the idea of his mother counting on him was better or worse than her silence. The single-story house directly in front of them was an odd creation that might once have been all brick, but was now labelled with a cobbled assortment of materials. Approaching, Quinn could hear the faint sound of children shrieking and laughing. He glanced at his mother. An almost invisible line of disgust wrinkled her nose. They walked up uneven steps, past a large pot filled with small green buds. Quinn ignored a sudden desire to touch the seedlings as his mother knocked on the door. Moments later, it was thrown open by a woman wearing a clean apron over her tattered clothes. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair piled on top of her head, and she had a smile on her face that froze as she took them in. She clearly knew who Adriana was. We are looking for Milo Valerius, said Adriana, her voice mild. Quinn focused on keeping his breathing even. He smiled politely, but he could barely feel it touching his cheeks. Milo doesn't live here, said the woman bluntly, her eyes shifting between Quinn and Adriana. Oh, said Adriana. She raised her eyebrows slightly at the woman. I must have been mistaken. Are you not Cecilia Valerius? On the surface, the words were light. Quinn wondered whether the other woman could hear the steel beneath them, and found himself hoping she could. He felt like they were speeding towards something. He just wasn't sure what, or how involved he was going to be in the crash. The woman's eyes shuddered further, but she did not blink. I am, said the woman, her voice polite but firm. But my son isn't here. He left home 6 months ago. I don't know where he is now. I see, said Adriana, picking a speck of dust from her sleeve. Then you won't mind if we come inside? Cecilia didn't move immediately, her feet steady as she held Adriana's gaze. But even she must have decided the cost of defiance wouldn't be worth it. She swallowed and stepped aside. The inside of the house was sparse but warm. Quinn kept his gaze focused on his mother's back. He hated feeling like he was intruding in someone's home. Have you ever read the Caller's Charter, Miss Valerius? Asked Adriana, her voice dangerously casual. Cecilia remained silent, but Adriana wasn't really looking for a response anyway. It says that callers are to be honoured as they serve the community, she continued. Of course, most callers are delighted to call for the good of the people. They are also bound to do so by law if such a gift manifests. Calling is a crime, said Cecilia, her voice soft. She kept her gaze forward, but Quinn could see a muscle in her jaw twitch. Quinn had never heard someone speak back to his mother. He felt a spark of admiration for this woman, who would so fiercely defend her ideals and her son. On the contrary, said Adriana, callers wasting their gift is the crime, quite literally. She turned to face Quinn. Quintus, I have a few questions to ask Miss Valerius, but perhaps you might like to say hello to the other children outside. It wasn't a suggestion. This was where his assistance came in. She wanted him to find Milo. He felt sick. Quinn pushed open the back door to find himself in a yard that stretched beyond the house in either direction, a communal area shared among the entire row of houses. Whatever game had been happening paused the moment Quinn walked outside, and he found himself face to face with a group of 12 kids staring at him. A few were younger than him, looking confused about why the game had stopped. Most of the others were about Quinn's age, studying him with fascination. And among them, Quinn noticed with dread, there was a familiar boy with bright eyes and curly, dark hair. Milo. A smaller girl tugged on the boy's arm. Your turn. Hush, Kiah, Milo said, softly, eyes on Quinn. We'll get back to the game in a moment. Who are you? Kiah asked Quinn, looking up at him. Quinn offered the girl a small smile, but even that felt like a lie. I'm Quintus, he said. Do you want to play with us, Quintus? Asked Kiah, and Quinn's chest hurt at her openness. Why don't you all hide? Milo told her, and I'll come looking in a minute. Kiah and the smaller children ran off. After a nod from Milo, a few older kids left as well, but mostly stayed close, shooting glances at Milo and Quinn. "It's nice to see you, Milo," said Quinn, because despite everything else, it was nice to see him. To know that he was okay, happy even. "I wish I could say the same," said Milo. "Are you here with your mother?" "She's inside," Quinn answered quietly, rubbing his chest. Was he really going to point Milo out to her? Milo seemed to be wondering the same thing. He eyed Quinn warily. "What's going on?" Quinn asked. He had his suspicions, from what his mother had implied, but he needed to be sure. He couldn't just show Milo without knowing why. He wasn't sure Milo was going to answer him at first, but then the other boy sighed and scuffed the dirt with his bare foot. "I never knew he had the calling gene in our family, and one day, it's so stupid. I don't miss much from life in Orbis, but I miss strawberries." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I was describing the taste to some of the others, and when I said the word out loud, there was this power to it. A moment later, a strawberry appeared. Someone must have reported it." He looked up again and met Quinn's eyes. Milo was a caller, which meant that he was legally bound to present himself to council. Recruiting him was why they were there, why they were here. "You don't want to be a caller?" asked Quinn. His chest felt tight. His own life would be so much easier if he could call, and Milo didn't even want it. "I want to have a choice," said Milo desperately. "I hated it here at first, but it's different. I get to see things grow, to be part of a community that builds things. Calling could help this community, though," said Quinn, "to move forward." He spoke the words, but looking behind Milo at the other kids, he felt the same divide in himself that he always felt when he thought about the Spurges. He found himself wishing he had Davinia's conviction that they were wild. From here, they just looked happy. Nothing good comes from nothing, Quinn," said Milo, his face solemn. Quinn opened his mouth to answer, just as the door swung open behind him. Moments later, his mother and Cecilia appeared. Cecilia's eyes flicked immediately to Quinn and Milo, but she kept her face carefully blank. She was breaking the law if she didn't give Milo up, and Quinn was pretty sure everyone knew it. But without proof that Milo was Milo, Adriana couldn't remove him. There would be an uproar. Council's relationship with the Spurges was already on a knife's edge, and there was no way Adriana would risk a riot. "Hello," said Adriana to Milo, her gaze flicking behind him to where the other kids were only half hiding now, then back again. I am Adriana." "This is Zacchaeus," said Cecilia quickly. "He lives next door." There was silence. Then Quinn could hear his heart beating in his ears. This was the moment where he was supposed to jump in and correct her. And yet Quinn hesitated. He didn't agree with Milo's choice, but he didn't want to be the one to take the choice away from him. His stomach rolled as he thought about how quietly furious Adriana would be at being denied her goal. But if Quinn didn't tell her, she wouldn't know, and without knowledge, she wouldn't act. Adriana Octavius was many things, but she was not impulsive. She valued control above all else. Quinn swallowed and met Milo's eyes. He saw the fear there and the resignation, and he couldn't do it. "It was nice to meet you, Zacchaeus." He was on top of a ridge this time. A breeze curled through his hair and danced across his nose, bringing with it the smell of rain and soil. Browns and greens stretched in an endless landscape before him, flecked by the occasional speck of colour. Quinn looked down to see a steady stream of green weaving through the soil and pulsing beneath his feet. Instead of seeming strange, as he might have expected, the sight sent a jolt of warmth through him. He bent down to touch the ground, his palm pulsing in response, his fingertips tingling as the glow brightened. Patterns danced in front of his face, and Quinn leaned closer. Quinn wrenched his eyes open, his heart still pumping to the beat of the imagined place. He touched the sides of his bed, anchoring himself. It was getting harder to remember that the fresh soil and glow weren't real. He looked down at his hands, which still seemed to pulse with a phantom green. Quinn brushed them on his sheets, as though by doing so he could rub it off. He leaned back against his headboard, willing the cool metal to bring him back to himself. When it didn't give him what he wanted, Quinn pushed back against it and swung his feet to the floor. The test was today. That thought pushed through the glow, still clinging to the edges of his brain. Today was the day where it would be decided whether or not he was admitted to the esteemed rank of caller. What happened if I failed? What happened when he failed? Quinn wasn't delusional. Given that he'd never called anything before, he knew that the likelihood of failure was high. But he was an Octavius, and if there was even a slim chance that calling ability would manifest under pressure, Quinn had to take it. As much as he'd rather stay in the place he'd apparently conjured in his head. Quinn shook out his arms and stretched his back. He held out his hand. He thought of Davinia's chair, of her confidence. He took a breath. Paper, he said half-heartedly. Nothing happened. Quinn sighed. He pulled open the drawer and grabbed his notebook, determined to focus on the test. He flicked past the early pages, ignoring the stab of dread and desire in his chest at the intricate green patterns etched on them. Not today, Quinn thought resolutely, flipping to a new blank page. What I know about calling, he wrote. He paused, pen tapping the paper. Calling is about intent. You have to want it. Most callers feel a tingle in the tips of their fingers just before an object manifests. Calling is in your DNA. If you're not a caller, if you were not born a caller, you will never be able to call. Quinn stared at the last item on his list. All Octaviuses in history were callers. It must be in his DNA. That was just science. He tapped the paper again, racking his brain for other facts about calling. Unfortunately, despite the many shelves in the Orbis library dedicated to calling records, there was nothing on how to call when you simply didn't have the ability. Quinn had looked. He ripped the paper out and studied it. He should at least try to practice calling again before the test. With a glance back at point 1, Quinn tried to picture a banana. Even though Davinia had said she didn't design things before she had called them, surely it couldn't hurt. He tried to want a banana, a green banana, growing long, stretching in either directions, patterns dancing through. Nope, no, that wasn't it. Quinn shook the dream away from his brain. A yellow banana, with no glow and no pattern. Banana, he said. Banana, he said again. He focused as hard as he could, ignoring the faint smell of rain and soil that seemed to tickle his nose as the dream lingered. Banana! He yelled. When nothing happened, Quinn felt like banging the table. He tried it just to see if it helped, then yelped when pain rushed through his hand. Idiot, Quinn muttered to himself. Quintus, his mother's cool voice sounded through his door. It's time to go. Quinn scrunched the paper into a ball and lobbed it into the trash. His mother would hate the idea of him writing down basic calling concepts before the test. She didn't come in though, and Quinn quickly changed into his clothes. It was time. They took a council vehicle to Chambers. His mother sat in the front, her back straight, eyes fixed forward. Quinn wondered if she'd miss riding Dawn. He would. Davinia sat with Quinn in the back. He could feel her eyes on him, but he kept his gaze fixed out the window. He didn't think he could take a bottle with her today. He watched the perfectly spaced trees along the sidewalk as the vehicle hummed past. Each was the same height, each neatly encased in a square box. Quinn thought back to the last time he'd driven past them, on the way to the Spurges the week before. A thread of guilt ran through him when he thought about the trip. His mother had been silently fuming when they returned home, but she hadn't questioned Quinn. It would never cross her mind that he might have withheld information she wanted. Still, Quinn couldn't help but wonder what Milo would be doing while Quinn struggled through his test, whether he would have any regrets. Much too soon, they arrived at Chambers. The building loomed in front of them, stretching across the entire block. Its shiny grey surface gleamed, dotted with windows in the same spacing as the trees on the sidewalk. Quinn watched the reflection of their vehicle as it silently pulled to a stop out front. As he often did, Quinn wondered how often someone cleaned the exterior of the building. He had never been brave enough to ask his mother, or to lick the wall and see how long the mark remained. Now is probably not the best time to try, he thought as they exited the car, although it might provide a good distraction. He followed his mother into the building, stumbling slightly when he realized she was intending to use the main doors, even though they were steps away from the side entrance. Quinn wasn't sure why he was surprised. Adriana Octavius was never one to make a subtle appearance. To Quinn's relief, once they passed through the main doors, the hallways were almost empty. He focused on breathing, listening to his footsteps bounce across the concrete floor, and trying not to look at himself in the shiny walls. Davinia was unusually silent, for which Quinn was thankful. Still, when they entered the foyer leading to the council rooms that served as testing chambers once a year, Quinn would have sworn the whole room turned to look at them. Quinn's throat felt dry. He couldn't think about the other kids there to be tested. Doing his best to ignore the rising worry, Quinn followed his mother to registration. She took a step back, far enough to give the illusion of independence, but close enough that she would still hear every word he said. Quinn cleared his throat. "I'm here to be tested," he said. The man at the counter barely looked up, keeping his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him and thrusting a metal pad in Quinn's direction. "Place your hand on this," he said, "so we can register your details." Quinn placed his hand on the pad, relieved that it wasn't shakingly noticeable. Quinn placed his hand on the pad, relieved that it wasn't shaking noticeably, and that the man hadn't looked up yet. It was nice to have a respite from people staring at him. He focused on the coolness of the pad, let it steady him. A moment later there was a beep, and the man behind the counter jerked his head up. His eyes met Quinn's, and then predictably flicked past him to Adriana. The man's face paled. "Master Octavius," he stammered. What a pleasure to have you with us today. Your testing room will be in room 3 in 10 minutes. If you'll just follow me, I can show you where to wait." He stepped out from behind the counter and beckoned Quinn forward, eyes flicking nervously to Adriana again as she and Davinia fell in behind them. "Thank you for your help," Quinn said quietly to the man, offering him a small smile. "I imagine you've had a long day." The man smiled gratefully back at Quinn before pausing, as though he'd finally worked up the courage to turn to Quinn's mother. "Miss Octavius," he said, "I'm sure you know that it's protocol for candidates to be tested alone. You did write the charter after all." His eyes darted from Adriana to Davinia and back again. "Of course I know, Marcellus," said Adriana. The man looked shocked that Adriana knew his name, but Quinn had a feeling he knew what was coming next. Adriana Octavius had not been elected chief counselor 10 years running for nothing. Quinn thought again of Milo's mother, of how impressive it was that she'd found the courage to stand up to Adriana. It is also in the charter that the chief counselor does what they need to keep themselves apprised of all council activities, Adriana said. This falls into that category. Then before Marcellus could open his mouth again, she stepped past him. "I'm sure you have other people awaiting your immediate attention," she said. Quinn's palms felt damp. Was he really going to have to take the test with his mum watching? "Quinn?" a voice sounded behind them just as they arrived outside their room. Quinn turned around to see a boy with neat hair, immaculate clothes, and a wide grin looking back at him. "Cass," he said, feeling the pressure in his chest ease at the sight of his best friend. How are you? I'm really good, said Cassius, still grinning. He turned his gaze to include the rest of Quinn's family. Hi, Miss Octavius. Hi, Davinia. Hello, Cassius, said Adriana, and Davinia gave him a small smile. Quinn glanced between Cassius to see an examiner step out of testing room 2. Have you just finished? Quinn asked his friend. I have. Cassius' smile grew bigger, and Quinn felt an odd mix of joy and illness at the clear evidence on Cass's face that it had been a success. It went well? He asked his friend quietly as his mother moved over to greet the examiner. It was great, Quinn, said Cass. I don't think I'm allowed to tell you much, but everything I called came straight away. I overheard one examiner say it was the best test he'd seen since, well, you know. He shot Davinia a small nod. That's fantastic, said Quinn, meaning it. Cassius had never said so out loud, but Quinn knew his greatest dream was to be a caller, and eventually to gain a seat on council. You're up next, said Cassius. How are you feeling? Once, Quinn might have told Cassius that he was dreading it, that he couldn't stop thinking about the moment when everyone would realize he was a failure. But as Quinn's calling ability had remained non-existent, and Cassius's had flourished, things had shifted between them slightly. They used to joke together about Quinn's failed attempts. Now, any time Quinn showed doubt or worry, Cassius looked at him with pity and discomfort. So Quinn forced a smile to his own face. A little nervous, he said. Cassius clapped his hand on Quinn's shoulder. We're both going to be callers by the end of the day. I know it, he said. He turned back to Davinia and Adriana. I should go and see Father. Tell him how it went. Be sure to tell him that he should be very proud of you, Adriana said to Cassius. Cassius flushed at her words. Thank you, Miss Octavius, he said. That means so much, coming from you. The three of them watched as Cassius walked out through the foyer. He will make a fine caller, said Adriana softly, but before Quinn could respond, the door to testing room 3 slid open. Quinton Octavius? A woman poked her head out the door. Oh, Adriana, lovely to see you, she smiled at Quinn's mother. Are you all coming in? Quinn felt his stomach sink into his feet as his mother and sister followed him into the room. Why were they coming too? Just to laugh at him? The door slid closed behind them, the soft click sealing them inside. The room was empty except for a metal table where a man was already seated. The woman who had opened the door took her place beside him, then gestured for Quinn to stand in front of them. Quinn wondered for the first time what the rooms were normally used for on a non-testing day. Well, Quintus, the woman began, why have you come to be tested today? Silence fell like a blanket over the room. Quinn traced the birthmark on his hand, knowing he had to be the one to speak first. He looked up at the examiners. Calling is in my blood, he said, trying to sound confident. From Davinia's snicker behind him, he hadn't quite succeeded. It is indeed, said the woman with another smile. I doubt this will take long at all. The man looked up. We'll start with something simple, he said. I'd like you to call a banana. Davinia snickered again. And Quinn tried desperately not to think of how many times he hadn't been able to do exactly this. This was it. Silence stretched out before them again. Quinn felt his stomach turn and his head thump. He knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't call anything. And in about a minute, everyone else was going to know it too. The man tapped his fingers against the table. The woman leaned forward. Quinn couldn't wait any longer. Banana, he croaked, feeling like his voice was scratching against the shining metal walls. There was another beat of silence, and nothing happened. The man and woman exchanged a glance. Quinn's forehead felt hot, and his palms felt sticky now. They knew. They knew. He stared at the wall, not quite sure what to do next. He wished he was anywhere else. He wished this was a dream and he could wake up from. The woman cleared her throat. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle. I imagine you're feeling quite nervous today, she said. Would you like to try again, dear? Quinn looked up at her. She smiled kindly back at him. Try again? Quinn felt a strange bubble of laughter build up in his throat. Excellent. That was just what he wanted. Another chance to prove that he couldn't do it. But before he could decline, his mother spoke for him. Of course he would, said Adriana smoothly. Quinn turned around to look at his mother, and she held his gaze. A smile touched her lips, but stopped short of her eyes. Quinn swallowed. There was no point in contradicting her wishes. She was chief counselor, so everyone in the room would defer to her. And if she didn't care that Quinn looked like a fool, so be it. Yes, thank you, he told the examiner. Perhaps this time you could try an apple, said the man. Quinn focused on a blank spot on the table. He closed his eyes and tried to picture an apple. He tried to want an apple with every part of himself. Apple, he said, just as his mother coughed behind him, but Quinn barely noticed the sound, because an apple had just appeared in front of him. There's those Octavius genes, said the woman with a relieved chuckle. Ha ha ha. Quinn stared at the apple, then looked down at his fingers. Weren't they meant to be tingling? They weren't tingling. He wasn't sure how he had expected calling to feel, but it wasn't like that. The moment before the apple appeared, he hadn't felt anything apart from the usual frustration. He thought about Milo and the strawberry. Maybe it was just a matter of wanting something badly enough, or maybe his stress had acted as a trigger, finally sparking his calling ability to life. Either way, he felt dizzy with confusion and relief. With speed like that, it's clear you're a caller, but regulations say you have to call 3 times, said the woman apologetically. She looked at the man who consulted a screen on the table. This time, please call Wood, he said. Quinn was still shaking from his success with the apple. He couldn't quite believe it. He pictured a long, thin piece of wood, imagined it appearing in front of him. Wood, he said, just as Davinia scuffed her shoe on the ground behind him. A short chunk of wood thudded into the room. The woman grinned, and even the other examiner looked like he had relaxed a little. He leaned back in his chair, studying the piece of wood. Well done, Quintus, he said. He exchanged another glance with the woman, who inclined her head fractionally. Finally, we'd like you to try calling fire. There was a small gasp from behind Quinn. We wouldn't ask it in most tests, the woman explained, but your speed with the last 2 items suggests that you might have the ability. She smiled encouragingly at him. Quinn wasn't quite sure what to think. Until that morning, he hadn't been able to call anything. Now he was supposed to be able to call fire? He focused on the space in front of him again, taking a deep breath and steadying himself. He doubted he'd be able to do it, but he had to try. He tried to picture the wood burning, flames licking from its middle. He tried to imagine its heat warming the room. Fire, he said. This time, when his mother coughed, it was a beat too slow. The examiners didn't notice. They were too busy staring at the burning log in the middle of the room, wonder in their eyes. But Quinn had heard it. The moment before the cough, the sound of his sister's voice, whispering the word along with him. Fire. He hadn't called it into being at all. It was Davinia. All Davinia. Congratulations, Quintus, his mother said as the room basked in the glow of the flames. Quinn jerked his head up and met her eyes, his chest aching, saw the unspoken warning there. Say nothing. And so, even as he reeled, as his insides churned and his head thumped, Quinn smiled graciously through the examiner's praise, felt their joy like a punch in the gut, and took the compliments that he did not really deserve. He held the smile in place as they all laughed about his first attempt at the banana, and as Adriana led him and Davinia back past the testing chambers and down the hallways to the main entrance. He held it in place as he heard the snatched whispers that another Octavius had shown exceptional calling ability, as he felt the eyes watching him all the way into the main foyer. Quinn clenched his hands and focused on the bite of fingers against palm as he put one foot in front of the other. Following his mother. Always following his mother. Their transport vehicle slid to the front of the chambers as they walked out of the building. Numbly, Quinn opened the door for his mother and sister. He stared out the window as they pulled away, unable to stand pretending a moment longer, but unwilling to face them yet. How long had they been planning it? Was saving face more important to them than the truth? The worst part was, if Quinn looked closely enough at himself, there was a small part of him that felt grateful that he wouldn't have to face down the public embarrassment. Even now, his name was being added to the list of callers. It would be officially announced at the end of the day. He wondered whether there was anything he could do to change it. Wondered what would happen if he marched into chambers and declared that his mother had lied. He knew. They'd never believe him over his mother. "Well done, Quintus," his mother said finally. Quinn turned to look at her, hating the flush he could feel darting across his face. "How long?" he whispered, unable to stop himself from asking for the details that kept tripping around in his head, or to stop his voice from catching. "How long ago did you plan it?" "We can clean and press your grandfather's robes," Adriana continued, as though he hadn't spoken. "You'll need them for the ceremony." "I can't wear them," he said, shaking his head. Adriana held his gaze, unblinking. The robes were traditional, a vestige of time long past when the first callers had wanted to distinguish themselves from the masses. Now they were only worn for the induction ceremony. Most callers chose to identify themselves via a simple wristband afterward. Privately, Quinn had always thought that wearing the robes at all was ridiculous, though he had craved it all the same. "You are an Octavius," said Adriana softly, "and you will wear the robes of a caller as all your ancestors have before you." Quinn felt his protest die in his throat. He knew his mother, knew that was as much of an acknowledgement as she would ever give, and she knew that once her mind was fixed, she wouldn't change it. He glanced at Davinia, who hadn't spoken the entire trip. She looked out her own window, but Quinn could tell she was following the conversation intently. He wondered how she felt, helping a little brother to mark himself, falsely, as her equal. And how was Quinn supposed to maintain the facade of being a caller? Was Davinia to spend the rest of their lives coughing and following him around? Quinn didn't doubt that their mother had a plan for that, too. The transport vehicle drew silently to a stop in front of their house, and Adriana pushed open the door and stepped outside. "We will, of course, celebrate tonight," she said to Quinn, before nodding once to Davinia and walking inside, leaving silence again in her wake. Davinia started to follow. "Dav," said Quinn, before he could stop himself. She turned back to look at him. Something Quinn couldn't describe raced across her face before her features settled into a carefully blank expression. "Please," said Quinn, unable to stop his voice breaking on the word. He took a short breath and met his sister's gaze. She stared back at him. "She first mentioned it months ago," she said finally, pushing his hand off her even as she gave him the information he wanted. "Though it wasn't confirmed until yesterday, when you still couldn't even call a banana." She looked Quinn up and down. "Caller?" She scoffed, shaking her head. "Congratulations, brother." She slid out of the car and continued after Adriana. Quinn dragged his feet to his room, his mind numb as Davinia's words sat heavy on his skin. He was going to be a caller. He pushed open his door and slumped down at his desk. He felt his eyes flick down to the trash almost automatically, like some part of him wanted to remember how foolish he'd been for even trying that morning. But the scrunched up list of calling concepts wasn't there. Quinn felt his heart pause, then thump back into its usual rhythm. What does it matter if she found it anyway? He thought bitterly, hearing the echo of his mother's steps down the hall. She already knows I can't do it. Sitting down at his desk, Quinn stared at his notebook until his vision blurred. He couldn't bring himself to open it, to see the pages from his dreams or the jagged line of the paper he had torn out that morning. He fumbled through his drawer for blank paper instead, needing to do something with his hands, even if he couldn't think what to write. He ran a hand across his face, embarrassed by the few tears that collected on his thumb and spilled down. Then he pressed pen to paper and watched as the ink spread slowly outward. He wished he knew why. Not why his mother had cheated the test. He was sure that was a matter of pride. But why he couldn't call? He was an Octavius. Why was he the first one who couldn't do it? Why did people like Milo get the gift when they didn't want it? If he wasn't a proper caller, Quinn had no idea who he was. Rolling his pen away from the ink stain, Quinn pressed harder, tracking letters along the paper. Quintus Octavius, false caller, dutiful son, sucker. His mind filled in the blanks that even in his current state, he wouldn't allow himself to write. He didn't need another piece of embarrassing paper for his mother to find. He traced the letter of his name until paper started to rip across the queue, drops of liquid falling more quickly onto the paper now. Quinn pushed his chair back from the desk. He had no idea what to do next. Should he keep practicing? He dismissed the thought almost immediately. He wasn't a caller, and maybe it was time to face that. He rubbed his finger along the mark on his palm, and the memory of his dream caught in his throat. The warmth he felt there. A wave of longing ran through him. He felt like running, screaming through the streets, or lying back on his bed and letting sleep claim him until after the official announcement. He wished he could recapture that sense of calm that came only during his dreams. But he didn't do any of those things, because a moment later, the piece of paper he'd just written on disappeared as though it had been sucked into the air. Quinn pulled in a breath, rubbing his eyes. He must be going mad. He ran his hand over the desk, pushing away everything else as he felt for the piece of paper. When the search was fruitless, he bent down to look on the floor, hoping it had somehow fallen down so quickly that he'd missed it. It hadn't. Maybe the piece of paper had never been there in the first place, Quinn reasoned with himself. Maybe he had just imagined getting it out. But when he looked at his hand, Quinn could see tiny ink stains. He had written something, and now that something was gone. It was like the opposite of calling. Quinn almost snorted. That would be just the thing. To not only not be a caller, but to make things disappear by accident. He rubbed his eyes again, knowing that despite everything, he was probably going to have to tell his mother. Even if he couldn't bear the thought of being near her in the moment. Even if she thought he was imagining things. But before Quinn could do anything, a wave of nausea washed over him. He grabbed the desk in front of him, steadying himself. His fingertips tingled, then his arm. He blinked as his hand seemed to shift in and out of focus, and then everything went black.